For Creamer Media's Polity, I'm Motshabi Hoaeane. Ebrahim Fakir from the Electoral Institute for Sustainable Democracy in Africa joins me to provide a pre-analysis of the 2014 national elections. During the build-up to the 2014 elections, there have been at least 4 incidents of political intimidation that were widely publicized in the media. Do you believe there is a problem of intimidation in South African politics, particularly in the ANC?
Well, I do think that we have a problem, and the Community Agency for Social Inquiry and a researcher called David Bruce has done fairly extensive work looking at political intimidation in the lead up to this election. But we do have a problem with the rise of political intimidation, but more importantly, a rise of what we might call political violence. And if you look at KwaZulu-Natal, as the election updates point out from KwaZulu-Natal, there have been instances of political murders, at least 4 or 5 of them, located around hostels, located around Inkatha Freedom Party strongholds, or perceptions that there have been an erosion in the support base of the Inkatha Freedom Party by the breakaway National Freedom Party. And you've had those kind of problems localized in KwaZulu-Natal, but happening across the province. So unfortunately, it's not just the ANC which can be accused of political intimidation or sometimes even dirty tricks, because there are subtle forms of the way in which you can affect the campaign of your opponents. And this research points out that it happens in subtle ways, such as locking people out from venues, or saying venues are booked up on spurious grounds when in fact they may not be, so that venues are not made available for campaign or for meeting or for other rally purposes, for instance. And we know that economic freedom fighters have accused the Tshwane metropolitan area of being politically manipulated by saying that the stadium is not available, and then there was a to and fro and a go-between between them, and now suddenly it is available. So, and then the research also points out, as David Bruce, the researcher, would attest, that there are times at which you will form rival rallies or hold a rival set of activities close to one which is held by an opposing political party. So, for instance, if one or other political party is having an event, ANC type people might organize to sing and dance and chant or toy nearby, thereby providing some kind of disruption. So there is that kind of thing. Should we worry about political intimidation? Yes, because suddenly you find that though we had high levels of political intolerance in the lead up to the 1994 elections and for about 5 years after that, by about 1999 until about 2006, we've had a reduction in interpolitical party violence and political intolerance between political parties. So you had a disappearance of no-go areas generally. There were few areas where political parties could not go into campaign and so forth. But as the interpolitical party violence had come down, the social violence associated with strikes or with social protests have gone up. But also around 2005, 2006, when you've had internal ructions within the ANC, and then shortly thereafter, 2 years later, the formation of COPE and the breakaway of COPE, you find that there was a greater amount of intra-political party violence. So political violence, intolerance within a political party, especially the ANC, because there were perceptions that, well, you might be aligned to COPE, you are sympathetic to this faction, you are sympathetic to that faction. And if you remember, the ANC youth leagues, congresses and conferences were disrupted by their own members. Sometimes they were throwing chairs at each other. There were political party meetings, primarily of the ANC, in which people hit each other at meetings. Sometimes people were threatened with guns and violence. So you had this rise of intra-political party violence. And that coexisted because there were fears that they would erode their support base, that they would lose support, they would lose membership, they would lose traction. But at the same time, you also found now, because COPE formed, you then had intra-political party intolerance coexisting with interpolitical party intolerance, and at the same time, the culture of social violence, political violence associated with strikes and social protests had continued. And so this form of political expression is in fact not one which you would like to have in a stable democracy. Of course, politics is about contestation and to some degree even a level of conflict. But when it starts to manifest in these ways, particularly in intolerance which translates into violence, it can lead to political instability in particular places, and in some cases also a limitation on the exercise of a citizen's rights. So in some cases, 3 or 4 of them, for instance, in Bekkersdal, the most notorious one, where voter registration procedures were disrupted. And so effectively a small number of people may not have been able to register because of the associated violence. So I think it is something we should be concerned about and something we should worry about. But at the same time, we should also address the generalized levels of political violence and social violence, more importantly, which we have existing in our society, which manifests in crime, in murder, in violence perpetrated against victims of crimes. And so they're intricately in some ways linked, because there appears to be a generalized culture within which this violence exists.
You explain in your article in the election update that there has been a loss of trust and confidence in political parties. What impact might this have on the national elections?
There's been a loss of trust and confidence in political parties, and more especially in governments around the world. And so if you look at worldwide polls in which public perceptions are tested about political parties, especially in countries in Europe, especially even in Latin America and across the African continent, citizens' trust and confidence in political parties is in fact quite low. Worldwide, if you aggregate all of the data, it's about 7% of people would have complete trust in political parties, and about 10% believe that perhaps we've got greater confidence in governments once they're formed to do the right thing, to address the social problems which might exist, to address the economic problems. Now, because of the global fuel, food and finance crisis, an increase in prices, hyperinflation, in some cases stagflation, even where you have high interest rates and high inflation, people believe that governments aren't doing what they ought to be doing, and so therefore their trust in government in doing the right thing goes down. But more importantly, because they believe political parties are the ones who actually fight for power, get the power, and then form a government, their trust in political parties is even lower. So on aggregate around the world, it's about 7%. In countries in Africa, it's slightly higher, because there's a reliance on political parties, and especially political parties once they form government, to do what people believe they ought to be doing. So they ought to be more responsive, more accountable, to do the things and devise an administration and a policy framework which addresses the major challenges faced by a society. So trust is slightly higher across the African continent, at probably around 20% of full trust in political parties and about 25% trust in government to do the right thing. But if you think about and you look at South Africa, the levels of trust, which may have been quite high, around 30% full trust in political parties, and especially the governing party, that level of trust has come down steadily over the last decade. And currently, if most public perception surveys, at least the reliable ones conducted by both the Human Sciences Research Council as well as the Institute for Justice and Reconciliation, in their Reconciliation Barometer, looks at trust and confidence in political parties, and it shows a steady decline coming down. Now, this is stemmed from the fact that it appears as if political parties themselves aren't as responsive and accountable as people think they ought to be. Some of this is manifested in the kind of social protests we see going on around the country, and again, on average, probably some people say 300 a year or so, and the figures vary, but they're very high, and it's something that government ought to worry about fairly seriously. But undoubtedly, we're not sure how this will affect the elections. It may manifest in a slightly lower voter turnout. What we do know, however, at the moment, is that though the IEC has reached its voter registration target, that means those people who have signaled an intention to be part of the political process and who have voluntarily said we're signing up for it through the registration process, is not as high as it potentially could be. That hasn't prevented the IEC from reaching its target of, let's say, registering 25 million voters. But there are about 32 million who are eligible or entitled to vote, so we're talking roughly 8 or 9 million people who simply haven't registered. Now, the interesting thing would be to see what the level of voter turnout is going to be. And if the level of voter turnout goes down, then there's something we ought to worry about. You might in fact find that the total number of voters goes up, but that's because there's been an increase in the population size. And so the real test will be for us to add those voters who registered but did not turn out, along with those who didn't even bother to register, and see what the proportion of those who voted and participated in the process is to those who didn't even bother to turn up, and those who registered but didn't bother to turn up. And so that will be a good, reliable indicator of whether we have an increased momentum for interest in the political system. Now, if there's a low turnout, and it's one of the potential consequences of the fact that there's a loss of trust and confidence in political parties, is that it might manifest in lower turnout. And if it doesn't manifest in lower turnout, it still means that government has a credibility problem and an operational problem, in the sense that while its legitimacy may not be called into question, the credibility of its operations are constantly called into question, in part by some of the protests which turn out on the streets. Now, some people say, well, this might manifest, and this loss of trust and confidence in political parties and in government in particular may manifest in an African Spring like the Arab Spring. But the point that misses is that here the legitimacy of government is not in question. It is not the right of the government to exist that people are complaining about. It is the ability of the government to be responsive, accountable, and devise policies which citizens view to be appropriate, adequate in resolving some of the major social challenges. What was going on in the Arab Spring was actually the questioning of the right of a government to exist. Here, that's not in question. It's a slightly different question. It's a question of the credibility of its operations. So the consequence of this loss of trust and confidence in political parties is not necessarily that there will be a sudden insurrection against the state, and that they will wish to replace the state with something else. That's not going to be the consequence. It may manifest in a lower political turnout for the elections, but we'll have to wait to see.
What is your view on the claim that the South African political system is akin to one-party rule?
You know, I mean, that's a very hasty conclusion to reach, that we are a one-party state. We might have features of this one-party state, and it's important to recognize, though, that our multi-party system and the freedoms which have been bequeathed us by our constitution ensure that the full features of an authoritarian or one-party type government are not completely in evidence. So while the ANC often does get its way and can use its majority in parliament, and has done so on many occasions, sometimes to the ill of the good of society. And so there's serious ethical questions about some of the ways in which they've used their majority, particularly when it comes to investigating Nkandla and the corruptions and abuses which may have been evident in that process, the way in which the Guptas landed their aeroplane at the Air Force Base. But there are also other ways in which we can say, actually, we have had changes which have happened. And if you think under the previous administration, the Mbeki administration, civil society activity to get public benefit for the provision of antiretroviral drugs was quite successful. The stopping of the Protection of State Information Bill, a concert of action between opposition political parties and well-organized civil society formations, brought pressure to bear on government not to have that passed. The same was true on the Traditional Courts Bill. And there are other interesting modes of oversight which are exercised by opposition parties in institutions, but also from public pressure brought upon by a well-organized civil society, have shown that we don't always have the features of a one-party state, nor do we have complete one-party rule. And we don't have the features of a single-party authoritarian system. What we do have is a dominant party democracy. But because a single political party is dominant, doesn't mean that it is illegitimately so. It has been tested, and its credibility or its legitimacy in government has been tested repeatedly through regular elections. That the majority of people happen to still vote for it might suggest that actually this is what most of the people who registered to vote are wanting. This is what they want. It is not entirely irrational. It is identity voting, yes, but identity voting is something which happens in all jurisdictions, all countries have, and all societies have people who vote on the basis of their identity, and identity is a polyglot. So it is the political party in which you most identify with, both in terms of race, and because of South Africa's history, race becomes one of the most prominent features of identity, but it is also about gender, it is also about culture, it's also about language, it is also about approach and the way in which you can view how a political party might be talking to you, how it raises or how it adapts to concerns that you might raise in the public space, and also the calculation of what benefits and changes it might have brought to your life. And so while we have deep problems with high levels of public perception that there is corruption at the upper reaches of the state, actually through repeated elections, and I suspect that pattern would be repeated in 2014, is that there does appear to be quite a signal majority in society which does believe that the ANC appears to be the most legitimate articulator of its political aspirations. At the same time, we shouldn't lose sight of the fact of the vital and fundamental role that political opposition, both inside the ANC and its alliance, provided by, amongst others, the Labour Movement, the Communist Party, and SANCO, along with political opposition parties which have provided good oversight and accountability, as well as a well-organized civil society which has brought pressure to bear. And so those political freedoms shouldn't be taken for granted and say, well, because we have a dominant party and have had a dominant party for so long, we are and have the features of a one-party state or an authoritarian state. There may be signs that we might be going in some areas within that direction, but it would be untrue to suggest that this is in fact a one-party state or that we have the features of the one-party state completely. This is not an authoritarian society, it is a democratic society. We do have concerns around the politicization, perhaps sometimes, of independent institutions like the public broadcaster, like the police, who are used for political purposes, or public institutions which are oriented to serve the interest of an incumbent political party. Those are important features we shouldn't lose sight of, but civil society and opposition parties are well aware of this and do play a signal role in how they combat this abuse of power, though sometimes the ANC's majority does allow it to get away with abusing power, and there are several incidences, some of which I've pointed to, in which they have done so. But that doesn't equate to the fact that we are an authoritarian or a one-party state.